So for today's conversation, we will be talking about the criminalization of immigration. My name is Felicia Arriaga. I am currently in the North Carolina Statewide Police Accountability Network Coordinator. And I also am an assistant professor of sociology at Appalachian State for a few more weeks, but excited to be here with some folks to talk about sort of how this looks in North Carolina, and excited to sort of hear their different perspectives on this really important topic, especially thinking about the intersections that it has with the criminal justice system more broadly. So we definitely welcome everyone to this conversation. We're excited to hear your questions. And this is part of the series of conversations for the Visual for Freedom and Racial Justice. If you haven't had a chance to go out to be with folks in person, we welcome you all to go to Raleigh, outside of the governor's mansion, to be in community with people. And these conversations are meant to accompany this month-long event that we're doing. Today's carceral system has direct ties and overlaps with the immigration system. And this stakes for non-citizens getting caught up in the carceral system are large. And often this happens in different ways. So today we'll be talking about sort of the ways that it happens at sort of the federal level. But these two folks have also been really involved at sort of looking into this at the North Carolina level, and specifically at the local level. So excited to be doing this. So I do just want to give an opportunity for our guests to introduce themselves briefly, and to briefly just tell us what kind of work you're doing in sort of this space right now. So I'm going to pass it over to Stefania first.
Hey folks, my name is Stefania Arteaga. I am the co-executive director of the Carolina Migrant Network. We're the Carolina's only legal nonprofit focused on representing people in detention and removal proceedings. So there are others who do removal work as well. And we mostly focus on trying to ensure that low-income immigrants have access to legal representation and have a keen eye to try to figure out how to push the needle against this collusion that we're seeing really between local law enforcement and ICE.
Yeah, and then I'll pass it over to Adriel.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Adriel Orozco. I'm a staff attorney with the North Carolina Justice Center's Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project. The Justice Center more broadly advocates for the elimination of poverty in North Carolina, and our project specifically provides legal services to low-income immigrants, as well as advocating for policy changes at the state and national level.
Great. Thanks, y'all, for being here with us today. I am going to be sharing a presentation with our slides from our presenters. So we'll drop the link, also a viewable link for you all if you're participating, and we'll be able to also link that to the live stream if you're interested in sort of seeing that component as well. But I wanted to start off with just sort of a little bit of an overview of what we mean when we're talking about sort of immigrant detention more broadly. So one of the things that we also wanted to make sure that we're talking about too is that even at the sort of federal level, when we're talking about immigration, and Stefania, I believe, and both Stefania and Adriel will give us a little bit of a longer history in just a second. But I wanted to make it sort of front and center that while we do talk about sort of immigration often as mostly sort of something that impacts Latinx folks, we also want to make sure that we're focused on thinking about how do we take into consideration how racism operates within this too. And so this is just a bit of information from Raíces, which is a group based down in Texas, that did some research looking at what this looks like for Black immigrants moving through the sort of carceral and the immigration systems. And so we see here that Black immigrants are often at greater risk for deportation, unfortunately. And I think we'll sort of hear a bit more from Stefania about some of the sort of deportation risks in just a bit. But we also see that they're actually having to pay higher bails as well to try to get out of that detention. And so this is more sort of looking at the federal level. But I also wanted to focus on some of the great research that the Budget and Tax Center, when they were still at the Justice Center, North Carolina Justice Center, was looking at, was thinking about what does this mean cost-wise for taxpayers across North Carolina, right? And so looking at some of the estimates here, Alexandra, who's the person who put this together for us a few years ago, was specifically looking at how much this was costing us in North Carolina as taxpayers, right? And so over the course of about 10 years, was finding that about $81.7 million was being spent to collaborate with ICE, right? And so we want to make sure folks recognize too that some of this criminalization of immigrants and this ICE collaboration that we'll dive into in just a bit impacts us too, right? If you're not an immigrant, I'm not an immigrant, it impacts us in a variety of ways. And it's really important for us to understand how much this costs too. We had a conversation last week about profit motivations within the carceral state. So really important for us to sort of think about these pieces too. So I'm going to hand it over to first Stefania, who's going to talk a little bit more about the history as it pertains to this sort of the criminalization of immigration. And Stefania, I definitely just want to hear, I know you're going to share some slides, but also wanted to just hear what you sort of see as like the challenge, like how did we get here? How did we get to sort of this moment where we see the criminalization of immigrants, and what does that mean for us? So I'm going to skip ahead 2 slides real quick. I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. So hey y'all, so this slide is a little overwhelming because I was trying to fit both languages into it. But I wanted to ground us in the historical context of what's led to mass incarceration and just the buildup of the immigration detention system. So I put 2 specific timelines here, looking at the early 80s and the early 90s. And where we see a lot of the groundwork being formed to, create the systems of oppression that we know today. So I started with the 80s because that's, closer to the late 70s, around the 70s, we started seeing a lot of shifts politically around further criminalizing Black communities in the country, around the creation of the campaign with the war on drugs. And at the same time, we start seeing that same narrative being trickled down in Latin America, through a lot of push for more mass incarceration in different countries as well. At the same historical time, we're also looking at significant US military intervention in Latin America. We see civil wars in El Salvador, Honduras, uprisings in Nicaragua that led to a lot of migration to the US. And we also see Reagan building up this campaign with Nancy Reagan around trying to end the war on drugs. There was like a big puppet that was very popular in the 80s. I forgot the name of the dog, but it was a dog that was trying to teach kids to fight crime and be against drugs. So we see this narrative really building up. We see around this time the creation of the first supermax prison in the US in Louisiana that has a vast history of enslavement. We also see the creation of the first corporate-owned jail in the country that used to be called Corrections Corporation of America, known as CoreCivic for folks in the immigrant rights space. That is a known name. It's one of the big players that has has large detention centers in the U.S. And we see these CCA popping up throughout the border, particularly. And then in the 80s, we also see, so as Reagan is really pushing this war on drugs narrative, we also see Reagan trying to wedge himself within Latino particular communities to try to create, he gave us a name, he created a Hispanic to categorize Latinos. He pushed an immigration reform bill that provide a pathway to citizenship to close to 3 million immigrants across the country, which came at a cost. It came at a cost of increasing border security, and also at a cost of creating kind of the groundwork for employment verification. And at the same time, we keep on seeing more bills introduced around criminalizing individuals, mandatory minimum sentencing. So this is the context very much in the 80s, building up for what the 90s ended up looking like, basically this war on drug mentality. And also, I think one thing I forgot to mention is in the 80s, we're seeing this large influx per se of individuals from Latin America due to the just chaos that is happening in their home countries because the Cold War basically moved down there. And then in 94, under both Bush and Clinton, we saw, at least in the immigrant rights perspective, kind of two very significant bills. Well, one, we see the introduction of IRA, so the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act, which is responsible for what is now 287G, which is the contractual relationship between ICE and law enforcement. We see mandatory detentions, so just the connection between certain specific crimes and reasons why people must stay in immigration detention and are ineligible for bond. And then crimes of moral turpitude. So this is where good moral character is challenged in the immigration court system, kind of connecting certain crimes to prohibiting individuals from being able to obtain immigration status in the future. And then, of course, we see more bill introduction to try to criminalize individuals in the criminal justice setting. With mandatory life sentences, the 3 strike rules, we start seeing the rise of the super predator narrative, really targeting the youth and trying to place youth into adult detention facilities or jails. And then we also see NAFTA, which played a big role into the migration of Latin Americans into the US as well. And so we're seeing we're going from the 80s and where we're seeing this developing narrative of trying to criminalize individuals through this narrative of the war on drugs. And we're also seeing this rise of militarizing and providing funding for immigration enforcement officials, and which then led to the 90s kind of figuring out how to further intertwine local law enforcement and ICE collaboration, as well as increasing the capacity of immigration detention facilities as well. And, I think I left it in the 90s partly because we kind of see a split in both the criminal justice lens and the immigrant justice lens to a degree because of what's happened with 9/11. I know Adriel will get to that in a little bit longer. But both the 80s and the 90s were important to build the foundation of what we see now as the prison industrial complex and the immigration detention pipeline.
Yeah, thank you for that, Stefania. And as a reminder, you probably said this at the top of your section that crimmigration, right, sort of means the criminalization of immigration law and procedure. And so, or one sort of iteration of that, I think in community spaces, which we'll get to talk about in just a little bit too, we often hear this in Spanish referred to as the polimigra. And so these are sort of interchangeable. They're different ways of thinking about how do we see these sort of intersections taking place? And I think the way that I met both of these folks was sort of in community spaces, making sure that we were also listening to community members, right? And sort of understanding how they're seeing these sort of complex policies being enacted all around them, right? And so often I think the first, or at least the first way that I sort of first even started thinking about this was by hearing community members talk about, right, the complexities of what's happening too. So I'm gonna skip a few slides and hand it over to Adriel, who's gonna take us into that next sort of section that Stefania was talking about. So sort of the 1996 shift in what we're seeing happening.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I think so. I kind of wanted to talk about three particular areas, starting in the 90s, like Stefania and Felicia were saying, around how immigration law was criminalizing the immigration system. And specifically, I wanted to give some examples around the benefits context on how immigration law criminalized more communities to prevent them from being able to get benefits or being able to regularize their status in the United States. In 1988, it was the first time that sort of this fictional term was created around aggravated felonies. And aggravated felonies in immigration law are really harsh. They prevent people from being able to get immigration status, they get mandatory detention, and they can also be subject to an expedited removal process where they have very limited due process rights, and a low-level immigration officer can order them deported, meaning that they can't see an immigration judge to prevent that removal. And so in 1988, it was the first time that aggravated felonies were created, and there were three, which were murder, drug trafficking, and trafficking in firearms. In 1990, three more were added, and so we have a total of six. But this IRA in 1996 dramatically expanded the amount of aggravated felonies to more than 30. And now it included certain types of crimes that are misdemeanors that may not be seen as serious, for example, shoplifting or theft or simple battery, filing fraudulent tax returns, things like that, that maybe a person didn't know that they were doing, but still were punished from the criminal punishment system, or just, youth and wrongful acts that people learn from, now could be things that could have really harsh consequences. The 1996 law also limited the immigration judge's discretion to be able to allow people to stay in the United States if they have some of these severe immigration related crimes. And then so, yeah, next slide. The other way that immigration law is criminalized is through the criminalization of the border. And so, as many folks know, September 11th, 2001 was really sort of a shift around a lot of the talk about the border and the increased militarization of the border. And when I say militarization of the border, it's really thinking about increased surveillance of the border, permanent enforcement at the border, and increased violence at the border. And so the federal government really used this narrative around xenophobia and Islamophobia and like being afraid of terrorists to really limit due process rights at the border, to increase funding for technology at the border, eventually to start to increase building of the wall at the border, many things like that. And so one thing important to know is that, there were 19 folks who hijacked planes, 4 planes that were used in the attack on 9/11. None of them came in through the border. However, the federal government used that narrative to really expand its surveillance, its use of databases, to really track movements, particularly of the immigrant community, folks trying to get into the United States, but also, citizens as well. And so they use words like invasion, or now currently we're seeing that narrative continue with folks who are coming to our border seeking protection, and the use of words like invasion, needing to vet everyone. It's a crisis, right? And so using those kinds of things to prevent people from entering the United States, but also to increasing the presence of the federal government on the border, and increasing detention at the border, and increasing, like when folks come in, they're processed, their fingerprints are taken, their pictures are taken, and all put into this national database to track them. And so I just wanted to give certain figures so folks kind of understand like this enormous growth of the government at the border. So in 1992, there were about 4,000 Border Patrol officers hired. In the present day, there are nearly 20,000. So that's more than 4 times. From 2005 until the present time, the Customs and Border Protection's budget has nearly tripled as well, and CBP is now the largest enforcement agency with a total of 64,000 employees. And so there's a huge influx of resources put into this agency. And one of the most concerning things for advocates is that there aren't accountability measures within this agency. They're also operating in an area where there are very few constitutional rights at the border. And so they're sort of given free rein in that sense. And then the next slide, please. Then lastly, I wanted to really talk about enforcement and sort of the criminal, the sort of pseudo-criminal enforcement system used in the immigration context, which is a civil law. And so one thing to note that came out of the early 2000s and post 9/11, there was this act called the Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act, which passed in 2001, which required federal agencies to share information with each other. And at that moment in time, I just remember that Congress and the president were very aligned. They were trying to pass many laws, like the Patriot Act as well, that tried to address the potential of persons trying to get into the United States to do another attempt. And so this particular act was passed in the Senate 97-0, and it was passed in the House 411-0. So essentially it had widespread support. But this is an act that the federal government right now is using to target immigrants within the United States. And so I say that because the federal government is using these databases to track people inside the United States and get into the jail. So in 2008, the federal government started a pilot program called Secure Communities. Their focus was supposed to be on dangerous convicted criminals. And it really started in 14 counties. Within 3 short years, the federal government's goal was to be in every jail in the United States. And Secure Communities had sort of 2 main components. One is that these jails, these participating jails and prisons and state and county systems would send information about the fingerprints from folks that came in through the jail to ICE, so ICE can check it amongst their database to see if that person had any deportation orders or had overstayed a visa, for example. And then the second part is that they would send detainers, which were requests for the jails or the prisons to hold individuals for ICE to then to go pick them up. Generally, the idea was that ICE had 48 hours after the person's release date to be able to go pick them up. And so in 2010, a lot of these jurisdictions that have signed up decided to actually start pulling out. They saw that a large portion of individuals who were being funneled into the deportation system actually didn't have criminal histories or they had low-level crimes. So the federal government had lied to us, no surprise, to really get into these jails. But then we find out that, hey, it's not actually voluntary, it's actually mandatory. And the reason it's mandatory is because now the federal government doesn't need the jails to give those fingerprints directly to ICE, because most jails, I would say almost all jails, when a person is brought into the jail, they're fingerprinted, and processed, and that information is sent to the FBI. And then the ICE is able to get information from the FBI. And so states don't have the ability to limit ICE from getting that fingerprint information. And really the only way to limit that information is for the state not to send their that information to the FBI. But states do that, or jails do that, because they want to see if there are any warrants for the person's arrest, or if there's other criminal history that they're interested in. And so by January of 2013, ICE now had access to information from all the jails and prisons in the United States because of their intersection in these databases. And so the last thing I'll say around that is that This was really started under the, at the end of the Bush administration. That's when secure communities started sort of taking form. But Obama really implemented this, and it had really tremendous effects for our community. From 2008 to 2011, more than 142,000 people were deported. By August 2014, 375,000 people were deported, and Obama was nicknamed deporter-in-chief. Democratic president really expanded this process and bloated this process to target immigrants because of their their connection to the criminal punishment system. So even if a person was just arrested, and in fact that still happens today, if a person is arrested, they don't even get to finish their criminal process. They are funneled into the deportation system. Even if somebody isn't, and aside from that, even if somebody is able to finish their criminal case and it gets dismissed because they've gone to probation, they've done rehabilitation, that can still count as a conviction under immigration law, because immigration law has a different definition of conviction. So really the immigrant community has really been scapegoated in a lot of ways, and the system has really been expanded to really funnel anybody who has any contact with the criminal punishment system into the deportation pipeline.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think we'll probably come back to these questions of like accountability, because I think that that's a huge question, not just for sort of the immigration system, but also more broadly, right, for the carceral state, right? Is this like, how do we create structures of accountability, and who is actually like in charge of things, right? Because I think that that's been such a big challenge in North Carolina, right? Is to pinpoint who do we sort of go after, right? If we think that these partnerships shouldn't exist, and how does that sort of like relate to the bigger carceral state? So thank you for that. Definitely sort of like some interesting sort of history here. I'm going to go back a few slides and pass it back over to Stefania to hear about some of the things that she's been working on the ground. I'll also say too that I met Stefania on the ground at a 287G steering committee meeting years ago. So always I'm excited to hear about sort of how I think her work has transitioned and what we're sort of seeing more broadly across North Carolina in this moment. So Stefania, please walk us through what's going on, what should we be expecting? And I think we'll also move us into the Q&A in just a bit so that folks can ask us more questions about how they can also get involved too.
Thank you. Yeah, so we initially launched the Carolina Migrant Network in 2019 as a response to ICE's retaliation to the amount of counties that ended their 287G agreements because of community pressure. And so in 2019, what was happening is that in Mecklenburg County, in Wake County, and in Durham County, in Buncombe County, we were seeing ICE launching intentional operations. At the same time, we were seeing the movement of HB 370, which was a bill that would require the collaboration between local law enforcement and ICE. It was actually a bill that was introduced by far-right leadership at the state legislature and the Charlotte ICE field office to retaliate because we had newly elected Black sheriffs, and also because of the severance of their relationship with ICE. And so we came to be because we were seeing high numbers of individuals that were being placed in deportation proceedings because they were coming into contact with local law enforcement. So about 3/4 of people in removal proceedings are individuals who have come into contact with local law enforcement. And so we know that it's very consistent with the criminalization of Black and brown individuals and who live in communities that are over-policed to begin with. And so that's initially how we started, to try to make sure that individuals had access to legal representation. And through that, we've seen a lot of shifts. COVID has happened since, right? And so that's changed a lot the way that individuals are moved throughout the states. Historically, individuals who were held in the Carolinas were actually detained in Georgia, because that's where we have the largest detention center in the Southeast, Stewart Detention Center. And initially that's where folks were held, but what ended up resulting was a couple of things. One, In Stewart, that's where men were housed, and in Irwin Detention Center, that's where the women were housed. And what we saw in 2020 were forced hysterectomies of women in at the Irwin Detention Center. That detention center then ended up closing, and then Stewart became a co-ed facility, and where we see now both male and female individuals being detained there. And we saw a shift from individuals being housed in Georgia to further south in Louisiana, and where we're seeing a shift in their mass incarceration system there. Not necessarily just relying on the prison population that they were trying to build, but also trying to integrate this new relationship with ICE to hold individuals in their prisons and local jails. So we're definitely seeing a transfer of bodies of individuals further out south. And where they're in most likely very rural communities with the lack of access to legal representation. I don't know if I mentioned this, but people in deportation proceedings, in detention, are not provided an attorney. And so therefore that makes it hard if you're arguing before an immigration judge and an attorney who's representing the US government. Post 2019, what we also saw was an increase of other contractual agreements between local law enforcement and ICE throughout the state. I want to say we have 16 at this point, primarily in rural counties. And we continue to see detentions of individuals who have come into contact with law enforcement. A good example that I have right now is that we had a client out in Brunswick County. He is diabetic, had a medical situation. The 911 was called, and instead the Brunswick County Police Department picked him up, arrested him on bogus charges, and then ended up transferring him into ICE custody. And then we're also seeing a shift in our state legislature, really trying to focus on strengthening the local ICE and law enforcement collaboration by trying to make it state law that local law enforcement ICE must collaborate. All partnerships currently through 287G agreements. So the 287G is like statute basically, and it's like the code used for the contract. It's called a 287G contract. That is all voluntary. There is no requirement to enter into these agreements. And so, however, the GA wants to figure out how to codify that and make it consistent. But overall, we have seen a shift in terms of even how the Biden administration reacted to immigration detention, the stay in Mexico order, now the end of Title 42. We saw a lot of earlier in the Biden administration mass deportations, primarily of Black immigrants from the Stewart Detention Center. And so, we can't talk about immigration detention or immigrant rights issue in a secular way and just say that it's Latino and Latino only, when in reality, it's a system that is very focused on criminalizing Black and brown bodies. And as anything goes with any type of detention center or detention system, racism and anti-Blackness is real and is rooted in the creation of these systems.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up, sort of, Stefania. Did you want me to progress to the next slide, or
Yeah.
Okay,
sure. Cool. So one of the things that we are also really interested in challenging a narrative within the immigrant rights community is making sure that folks are challenging what's happened in immigration court. So we have an immigration court here in Charlotte, where I'm based out of, that is for individuals that are in removal proceedings in North and South Carolina. And we are trying to create dynamic CLEs, so continuing learning education credits for attorneys, and where we can kind of think differently and try to strategize ways that we can better represent people in deportation proceedings. And so we're hosting the CLE in January, which is trial practice for immigration attorneys. We have 3 amazing attorneys, as well with Becca O'Neill, who's our co-director, who focus on crimmigration. And so Rob Heroy actually led really awesome litigation to challenge the detention of individuals in the Mecklenburg County Jail by the Sheriff's Department for ICE. That made it all the way to the state Supreme Court. And so we are trying to make sure that we continue to create programming that is responsive to the ongoing issues that we're seeing in our community.
Thanks. I'm going to stop sharing now and we'll sort of open it up for questions in just a second. But I think my, Stefania, to your point, and thank you for sharing that information about the CLE that's coming up. Can you talk a little bit about why the focus on immigration attorneys? I think both you and Adriel mentioned sort of this issue of representation and sort of what rights immigrants have. So just to be very clear for folks on the call, for folks who might be watching live, can you just mention briefly why y'all are tackling maybe this side of this bigger sort of issue?
Yeah, so first of all, like the Charlotte Immigration Court ranks last for people with representation for before the Charlotte Immigration Court, meaning that the vast majority of individuals in removal do not have access to an attorney. It's not like the criminal injustice system and where there could be a point accorded attorney, but our folks simply don't have that. You know, I think also it's important to be able to provide materials. We see it as important to challenge narratives within the broader immigrant rights legal space to ensure that when we talk about immigration detention, we're not simply talking about asylum seekers, but we're talking about individuals who are also caught up through the criminal injustice system and then end up transferred to ICE custody. Those are cases that we do take. And so we know that often for families, we are in this region the only option because we focus on the intersectionality of immigration and the criminal injustice system.
Super helpful.
I was going to mention, I forgot. And I don't know if Adriel wants to mention anything.
The only thing I'll add is that immigration law is complex and it's increasingly more complex. And especially asylum law is very complex. And so unfortunately for folks who are seeking asylum, one, usually they just came into the United States and they don't have any resources, expended all the resources just to get to the border. And then at the same time, now they're confronted with a very complex system, a very complex process, as well as a law. And so I think having an attorney increases their ability to get assistance exponentially. In addition to that, I think it's really interesting to think about the values of the federal government. They hire ICE attorneys to fight people so that they don't get relief, but they don't actually provide funding so that unrepresented individuals can get an appointed attorney if they can't pay for one. And so I would just thought that that's really interesting, is that we in nonprofits, you know, unfortunately, we just can't take every case, but there aren't enough of us to try to help folks who are low income or who can't afford an attorney. And so I think it really just puts people in a really tough process where even if they could otherwise qualify for relief, the federal government has really stacked the system against them.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And hopefully Peter already has some questions about this. So Peter, hopefully some of that helped answer one of your questions about legal representation. For other folks who are here with us or if people are watching on Facebook, please let us know if you have some questions. I'm going to try to get through some of Peter's first, and then I have some other questions as well. But if you're on the Zoom with us, please feel free to drop in the chat or raise your hand and I'll be able to call on you as well. One other question that Peter had here was a question about border police and probably more so border patrol. Is sort of, are they using sort of citations or summons, or is it always sort of the equivalent of a arrest warrant when we're sort of thinking about how people are arrested at the border? And I might pass that over. To you, Adriel, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'm not sure if my response will be completely responsive. So Peter, if you want to add more information about the context of your question. I guess there are different ways a person at the border can be detained by Border Patrol. And so that's either they present themselves to the port of entry, trying to seek asylum. And so then they'll be moved to a processing center, and then the government will make a decision whether or not that person will be sent to a detention center, a longer term detention center for immigrants, or if they'll be released under a parole or some other type of tracking system for the individual. Internally in the border region, Border Patrol also arrests individuals, and there's a lot more leeway in the way that Border Patrol can arrest individuals in the border region than there are for officers outside of that border region. So for example, I've spoken to Border Patrol officers who say that they will essentially look at people and based on facets of like what they're wearing, possibly like what skin color they have, and kind of thinking about, you know, ways to identify the person was a recent entrant, right? Because there are folks who enter in areas not designated for entry, and they get into certain communities. And so that's another way that they can use sort of like just like racial discrimination against individuals on the border to try to identify them as potentially not citizens of the United States. And so Border Patrol can also stop individuals for, you know, driving quickly, and because they have some other type of indicator that maybe they might be transporting somebody within their vehicle. So sometimes it can, it really depends on what the Border Patrol is using as a reason to either sometimes collaborate with others. There's a lot of checkpoints in the Southwest as well. You know, I'm originally from New Mexico, and we had to go through a checkpoint every single time going down to the border and up. And so the government has just a lot of different ways that they can funnel folks through Border Patrol, even if they're not physically at the border, into a detention system.
Yep, thanks for that. Do we have other questions? I know I see a few more in the chat, but definitely wanted to give more folks an opportunity to participate if you have some questions for folks too. And we've got about 10 minutes left or so. So one of the things I did want to ask you all briefly, because part of the goal of this visual is to make sure folks understand how they can take action, either locally or there's a question in the chat about some federal types of actions as well. So my question for you all is, where do you see opportunities for accountability, and how can people plug in specifically on this issue? And I'll drop that in the chat too, just to give you a second to think about it as well.
As going nose goes, obviously not on, but I'm happy to share. I think just like kind of looking at it through like an IR perspective, I think that right now federally anything's very challenging to move forward. This is a scapegoat issue, and I think that we're far from any real progress happening anytime soon. I think our focus really lies on challenging local elects at the local level, like our sheriffs, to push for different policies. You know, I think in Mecklenburg County, we were seeing 1,200 people being processed for removal because of the 287G agreement per year, roughly around. And through the severance of that partnership between Localize and the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office, that's been a huge benefit, right, to the community. So I think, yeah, and I think also most importantly is I think often we as advocates need to do a better job of really looking at of how we talk about the system, and not just like keeping it secular or very narrow, that this is just immigration detention or immigration. It's all part of like the mass incarceral system in general. And it's important to advocate for other issues apart from 287G partnerships, but you know, like citation and low arrest and other issues like that as well.
Yeah, I think I think it's a little bit of it's a hard question to answer just because of the systems that exist and how to push back against those systems. However, I think definitely either one, some introspection from individuals and thinking about what it means to like criminalize communities, I think is really important. But I think also then holding our electeds accountable, whether at the local, state, or federal level. There is, and to Peter's comment, there is plenty of data that shows that private detention centers, or even the CBP processing centers or detention centers at the border are inhumane. They treat people terribly. The CBP centers are called hieleras or freezers because they're cold. They're not meant for children or families. And we saw in the Trump administration that families and children were being held there. And so I think it just, in a lot of ways, we need to think about how is it that we're moving away from this punishment system. Right now in Congress, they're talking about, Senator Tillis is in negotiations with Senator Sinema of a potential bipartisan deal for folks who have DACA and otherwise entered when they were young. And some of the things that we heard about in the Washington Post article is the increased amount of detention centers for regional processing centers for that would include space for families. And so I think we need to really rethink about how those systems are being used really to punish and limit people's access to resources. So one of the scariest things about detention centers is that like I've had clients who are detained and it's really hard to get access to talk to them. They have to pay for the calls out. Those calls can be monitored, so confidentiality is an issue. Those folks can't get, even if those folks have lived in the United States for years and have family members, those detention centers are remote, they're not easily accessible, it's hard to get documents. And so in order to, and again, the system is stacked against them. They don't have to be detained. This is civil law. People are not supposed to be punished. And so I think it's really rethinking why these systems are so intertwined and then voicing that. And I think right now we would have very different conversations about the border. Like, there are a lot of folks who are fleeing violence, are fleeing instability from their home countries. This is a regional issue within our hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere and in Latin America, as to why people are coming here. So we need to be having conversations about that. And I think that there was polling done that 73% of individuals want a strong asylum system so that people can request protection. So I think it's really speaking up and not letting like the xenophobic and far right folks drive the narrative. Like we want a welcoming system, and we don't want people in detention centers. We want case management systems. We want people in the community. And we don't want to re-traumatize people and traumatize people and create more restrictions because the policies that have been used for the past few years is a policy of deterrence, a policy of making people so scared or so tired so that they don't actually advocate for their rights. And that's, I don't think, what we want as a country. So I think we need to be more vocal in pushing that narrative and then countering the xenophobic and far-right narrative that permeates the media.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think the narrative piece is such a big piece of our work, and it should be more sort of prominent, I think, in the way that we sort of tackle this issue as well. So we've got about 3 minutes left. So I do want to give a chance for you all to do a few things, to do sort of action steps for us. So one, I believe someone on this team will drop in the sign-on letter for the visual more broadly. So if you're watching, if you're sort of in the Zoom right now and you haven't signed the letter, please definitely sign on to that. The next community conversation that we'll be having is on living conditions and isolation in North Carolina prisons. So please make sure to join our next conversation for that. And then I'm going to wrap up with just a few asks. So obviously, Stefania mentioned the CLE that's coming up. And so if you know some attorneys who might be interested, if you're an attorney who might be interested, please definitely sort of check that out. And I think we'll be able to share that information. We have a few other resources that we'll also be sharing out, which specifically talk about this issue for specific groups as well. we've already sort of mentioned a little bit, right, that at the federal level, there's some sort of conversations happening. And I think one of the things that we're gearing up for at the state level here in North Carolina is that we'll see another push to try to force law enforcement in North Carolina to cooperate more with immigration enforcement at the local level. So definitely check in with ACLU, with the Justice Center, beginning with the new legislative session in January, February, because unfortunately we'll still be fighting back against this bill, these different bills that attack our communities. So definitely keep informed about that. And then Adriel, I don't know if you had another ask around transfers potentially for folks who are, if you don't, that's totally fine. But is there an ask from the Justice Center that you wanted to highlight as well?
Yes, I'm watching a poll right now. A lot of people, when they come to these events, they ask how they can get involved. And so these are, if you want to answer this poll I just launched about the ways you're willing to support our advocacy efforts. If you answer those, we can get in contact with you somewhere down the line when these issues start cropping up in our legislature. So please feel free to answer that, and we can help you get plugged in and get involved. Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us. There's a lot of information in the chat. And yes, if you fill out this poll, we'll be able to get back to you with this information. We really appreciate our interpreter for today as well. And go out to Raleigh. Please go be in community with folks who are working on this. And we would just really appreciate you all joining us today.